Hey, so let's talk about failure in experiments. This is not talked about very often because when you read papers or when you go to a talk to listen to somebody's research results, what you hear about is the stuff that worked. What you may not realize that very often behind all the stuff or underneath all the stuff that has worked out in the end, there is this mountain of failure. I want to go through some of these failures. I call them good failures and bad failures, and just want to make a few comments about what you could potentially learn from these failures and how you could avoid them in the future to the extent possible. So there's the good failures and there's the bad failures. So the good failures, I think there's two kinds of those. The good failures that work really well basically is when you try out a whole bunch of crazy new ideas. You set up maybe little experiments to minimize your risk and the time investment, and you just try things out, and just a lot of these things they will not work out because you're trying something new. And I think that is a completely, totally fine way to fail because you have not invested so much into it. You had another sort of, let's say, mainstream project, and you're just trying little things out. This is what you should do. I think you should allow yourself to fail many times trying like little things out. So I think this is a good failure. And what you learn from it is, well, you learn every time, oh, this didn't work, maybe I can try that, or maybe that idea is not a very good idea, maybe I should pursue another idea. So basically it helps you focus on what might actually work going forward. So this is a good failure. And you're doing everything right. It's often not acknowledged, though, that you should do these little projects, and you should allow yourself to fail, because failure is so stigmatized, I guess, in academia. Everybody portrays themselves as always being wonderful and things working out perfectly just every time. It's just not the truth. But this kind of failure, I think we should allow ourselves, and we should maybe establish a better culture to appreciate these failures and learn from them. Another kind of good failure that's admittedly fairly rare is that something went wrong in the course of the experiment. May not have necessarily been your fault, and the experiment as originally planned basically failed. There's well, no way around that. But for some reason there is something that happened that you observed that was actually interesting and could be used for something quite different. And that depends on you very carefully observing what was going on and to be open enough to discover another angle with which to, or from which to view your potential results. Let me tell you a story. This happened to me not very often, admittedly, but there was one case where this happened. It was adding mycorrhizal fungal inoculum to an experiment of different fungal species. And at the end of the experiment, well, none of these things led to any colonization of the plant. So it was obviously a failure. That experiment did not work out because the mycorrhizal fungal inoculum, or the fungi in the inoculum, were no longer alive. So the experiment failed. Maybe I should have done that better by first testing if the inoculum was still alive. Anyway, I didn't do it. But then what I noticed, there were still differences in the parameters that I had measured, like some soil parameters. And that got me to thinking, well, if the fungus was no longer alive, because obviously I can see no colonization, so there was nothing alive in there in terms of fungi, maybe it's the other stuff that was in there that caused these effects, and the other stuff were the other microbes, the microbiome that's associated with the fungal inoculum. And I literally took these samples out of the trash can again. This is a long time ago now, and analyzed them again, and analyzed them also for the microbial community. And I kept analyzing them, and in the end it led to a research idea that actually was in the end a proposal that in the end got funded. And it was just basically purely thinking about your failure and seeing if there was another angle by which you could turn this into a success. As I said, I don't think this will happen very often, but I think it's always important to keep an open mind and see if you cannot take your failure, like a contamination or any kind of observation that you do during your experiment, and somehow turn it into a success. Well, then there is the bad failures. Maybe there's kind of two of those. Maybe there's very many, I don't know, but two that I can think of. One bad failure is you set up an experiment and you just hadn't thought things through. So for example, you pseudo-replicated one of your factors, or your experimental design was flawed, you didn't randomize your experimental units, you missed an important control, or many other things that things can go wrong. I mean, it's complicated, right? So it's bound to go wrong, but those are things that are avoidable, which is why this is a bad failure. So you could have, for example, presented it in a lab meeting if your group offers lab meetings, or you could have asked friends, or it's good to consult with other people generally, maybe also that are slightly outside of your bubble or they're more experienced, some other mentors, because these are totally avoidable failures. And so you should do everything to keep those at a minimum. And then there's the other kind of bad failures that things went wrong, but they were not your fault. Right, I had those during my PhD. I used some state-of-the-art, I thought, growth environment facilities. And it turned out the environmental controls did not work at all, right? I mean, there was nothing that could be done. The experiment was completely for the trash. I lost maybe like at least half a year, maybe a year during my PhD because of that. Of course, that's irritating. That kind of stuff always happens. It wasn't your fault. It's still bad. There's nothing you can get from it. But these things happen. It's just life. Also, it happens to everyone. I'm sure at some point something went wrong in some experiment. It had nothing to do with you. You did everything right from your perspective, but then maybe some control failed, or some device broke down, or some other intrusion happened that had like nothing to do with you. Well, there's no way around it. You got to do it again. You got to try to do it in a different way. But what you can do to minimize the impact of these kinds of failures is, to spread your risk around, to try many things, to have many things going on at one point in time. Don't put all your eggs in one basket, because if that one thing fails, I mean, it's definitely a setback. There's no question. I mean, it's demoralizing, it's demotivating, and basically it's terrible when it happens. But if you have many things going on, in parallel, also of a different kind, maybe something more experimental, something more observational, something more data synthesis, something more conceptual. And if you spread your risk around in this way, then the relative impact of that failure is not as big as it would be otherwise. Also think about if, for example, is it a long-term experiment, or is it any kind of experiment? Can I have some intermediate milestones that I can measure something as this experiment is running that are still informative and maybe could still give rise to a manuscript, even if it doesn't work out all the way to the end? So can I basically have some default breakpoints at which there is still something interesting to be gained? Of course, this is not possible for all experiments and in all situations, but I think it's good to think about these. What if something happens at that point? Can I still use these data up to that point, or whatever? Or can I sort of save something in between? Can I store some samples in between that I can still analyze? I think it's worth thinking about that as you plan your experiment. Also, try to plan them a little bit with these potential failures in mind. As I said, they will not always work, these plans, and failure absolutely cannot be prevented. I mean, there will always be something happening. But I think as much as possible, try to already include it in your design plans for your study, that something might go wrong. Well, anyway, I hope you have a lot more good failures than bad failures, and I hope anyway that your next experiment is going to work just splendidly.